Thank you so much for having me. It's neat to return back to the medical educational space to talk with folks that on an everyday basis do medical education, and I'll talk a bit about my background in that area, in your area of the world, in a bit. But quite honestly, let me first respond with thank you for acknowledging the Nipmuc Nation. And I want to add here that, land acknowledgements, though they're good, they're also problematic. And they should be done with a sense of careful consideration, not only of what they do or do not say, but also of how they reflect on this idea that Native people, as scholars, as community members, whether you're an anthropologist or a medical physiology faculty member or something else, that we're oftentimes not with you on an everyday basis to tell you where you're at. So land acknowledgements oftentimes are used as a distraction from the fact that, let's be honest, we should be there with you and we're not as Native people. So I want to start with that. But today's conversation, quite honestly, let me go back to land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements oftentimes describe Native people as stagnant or local. We're on a reservation, or we're in a local area, or we're, what is the term that's often used? We're caretakers of land. These kind of ideas oftentimes dismiss the fact that, and this is the subject of my first book, that Native people oftentimes have been at the core of medical education in the United States, at the core of science and technology, at the core of politics in the United States. The Indian Health Services and other aspects of American healthcare, not just Indian Health Services, would not be where they are without members of my tribe, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, who have worked in pretty much every corner of Indian Health Services and every corner of healthcare in the United States. Again, you don't see us because there's been a very purposeful erasure of us over time. And that is going to be the topic of my talk. So the topic is evolving from Hippocratic Oath to Indigenous Oath. And I made this topic, or this title, I created this title very purposely because I believe that even if you don't think that you do, a lot of people who are non-Indigenous, non-Native believe that indigeneity is something that we've evolved from. So everybody's Indigenous from somewhere. You're Indigenous relatives existed in Europe at one time, or in Asia, or in Africa, or in South America, or somewhere across the world. But in this grand scheme of things that we call the American dream, where America is this melting pot of immigrants, right? And you hear presidents of universities and presidents of the United States always say this is a nation of immigrants. Well, it's a nation of immigrants within the context of erasure of Indigenous peoples oftentimes. And what happens is when you have a bunch of people who come into, especially the United States, with this idea that this nation is going to somehow give them that dream that their family has been, trying to achieve for generations, they quickly not only erase the Indigenous people in that nation, especially the United States, but they erase their indigeneity. They erase the communities where they come from. And we had a great speaker at MIT this past year, Jay Julius, who used to be the tribal chairman of the Lumbee tribe of, not to be confused with Lumbee, the Lumbee tribe of Washington, who actually during one of our conversations during a conference about climate change said, what are people running from? Or I'm paraphrasing there, but he was basically asking, what are people running from? He was saying something to the effect of, I really want to ask people why they left Europe, why they left Asia, why they left their homes oftentimes to come here to the United States. And if we can begin to answer that question in different, those are nuanced conversations, but if we can begin to answer that question, why did your family, or why did your people, your collective kin network, why did they leave one place to go to another? That actually will help us have a better, more earnest, more just conversation about American Indian, Native American, and Indigenous peoples in the United States. So this photo that I have placed here on the kind of front cover of the presentation is a physician who played for the Kansas City quote unquote Chiefs, derogatory name, in the 2020 Super Bowl, I believe. And he made headlines because he quickly after the Super Bowl had to return to COVID torn Canada to treat people in the pandemic. And what I found interesting was all of the advertisements for him and, his historic kind of regal return to Canada to treat people during the pandemic, he was covered consistently with these arrowheads. I'm like, I can't even hear his story without being stigmatized or being traumatized by these kind of symbols of Indigenous erasure that are embedded in the Kansas City quote unquote Chiefs mascot. or team name. So I want that to kind of linger in your mind there, because I think there's always these interesting connections between healthcare, sport, and public kind of political life in the United States that always kind of play in and around each other. And I'll get back to him in a second. All right, so who am I? I went to MIT, graduated. I actually started in MIT in 1999, and as with most or a lot of Native American Indian students, I actually had to take time off for my undergraduate degree. So I was there till 01 or 02. I left for a couple years, and I actually returned. So I ended up finishing my bachelor's degree at MIT in the end of 06. I went between chemical engineering to chemistry, and Nicole, who might be my wife, who might be on this Zoom, we used to joke all the time. She would ask me, like, when are you going to pick a major? You know, when are you, we've been dating and have been married forever. She said, when are you going to pick a major? And I'm like, I'm really going through some things. Like, I feel like what my degree should be, what I'm studying should be emblematic of this journey that I'm on as a Native person. I didn't understand what I was talking about at the time. I just felt it. But now I truly do understand that a lot of Native students enter into higher education, not just as undergrads, but also as medical students, as professional PhD students. They enter into education with the sense that they're trying to kind of live up to a colonial standard. And sometimes in the middle of that, it can be a different kind of parts of their education. They actually get a better feeling of who they are within the colonial educational infrastructure. And they say in a particular moment, no, this education is going to be about me. And I'm going to actually turn it into something that is fulfilling for me and for the people that I come from, and for the dreams perhaps that my grandparents and my ancestors had for me. So anyway, I finished at MIT, and I quickly moved into UNC Chapel Hill in 07. Funny story, Michael Jordan, the basketball player, and I shared the same anthropology advisor at UNC Chapel Hill, 23 years apart. So one day in the future, sometime in, past 3 years from now, I think I might write a book about that, about the interconnections between my life, Michael Jordan's, and the discipline of anthropology. But yes, I was funded by the NSF, and the NSF actually told me something. The judges, when they give you grade sheets during your NSF application, for anybody, students who may be interested in applying for the NSF, the judges actually have some leeway in how they kind of narrate their judging of you. And one of the judges basically said, in no uncertain terms, the discipline of anthropology needs you. And it was like this heralded, this like dynamic, divine, heavenly kind of voice coming from this piece of paper that basically gave me a lot of confidence at that time. And I realized in that moment, where I was being funded by a national organization, and it was a healthy fellowship, right, financially, that I was in the right track. But at the end of the day, all of this goes back to the fact that I am a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. You could call me a citizen. But I became an anthropologist back when I was like 4 or 5, reading the books that my grandfather self-published in like 1959 to 1962, in the middle of Jim Crow, before Martin Luther King had a dream. My grandfather, a Lumbee man who had fought in World War II, he wrote a book that was called Invasion of America, and he self-published it. I still have like 5 copies of it. And my dad was, before he passed away, was like, do not do anything with these books. Always keep them. And for him, and I always say, like, that took a lot of like confidence to write a book in the middle of Jim Crow in 1960s America, to say, no, this was Land Back before Land Back. My grandfather wrote the Land Back book before it was ever written by or said by anybody else. Anyway, long story short, before I begin officially, I want to wish a happy birthday to my baby Gabby. She's our niece. As you can see here, she's always been on top of me, both metaphorically and literally. And I talk to her a lot about life, and Nicole, my wife, does too. So this is her birthday. So I just want to wish her a happy birthday, even though I know she's not listening to this. All right. So my relationship with the medical educational sort of community began in 06. I actually was going through anthropology at MIT, and I actually started having conversations with people in the Lumbee community of southeastern North Carolina. So we're basically, if you've ever driven down I-95, you get down to North Carolina, you go below Fayetteville and Fort Bragg. Once you hit Fort Bragg, that is our tribal national sovereign land. That is land that is owned and will always be owned, despite what the government says, by Lumbee people. Our relatives are buried there on Fort Bragg. But once you get to Fort Bragg, that's our territory. You go down into Robinson County. Before you get to South Carolina, where there's a big sombrero hat, that's all of our land. And I argue that our tribal land actually goes down into Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And now, if you go down to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Lumbee people from our tribe own houses down there, like, many more than they owned like 10, 20 years ago. And I believe it's because we all consider that our tribal territory. South of the border, in case you're not familiar with it, is a theme park that is Mexican themed, but it actually began as south of the Robeson County border. It started out as it was started out as south of the Robeson County border. It started out as a beer depot that a man named Alan Schaefer opened after he made a deal with the governor of South Carolina and the sheriff of Robeson County, North Carolina, to sell alcohol to American Indian people in Robeson County, so Lumbee people. And so a lot of people don't realize that this really odd theme park is not Mexican theme. It actually was formed around American Indian people, and it actually funded because all these American Indian people from North Carolina were forced to go down there to buy alcohol and to party and to have other leisurely sort of activities. All of that money from these American Indian people from my community, funded one of the largest beer distribution networks in southeastern North Carolina. And I believe it was Milwaukee Beer or maybe Budweiser. I'm not sure which one, but he ended up being the largest distributor of alcohol or beer in southeastern United States from like 1960s, late 1960s until like the early 1990s. But anyway, that's my area. And I've been having a lot of conversations with Lumbee people in that area about healthcare, about health, about well-being, about being a doctor, about being a physician. Nicole, my wife, she was in medical school before she hurt her back. She had to leave because of physically not being able to continue with medicine. She and I are friends with Holly Pilson, who's the person down here in the lower right-hand corner. She's a Lumbee. She is a physician at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. She's on faculty there. And she partly leads diversity there. I'm not sure to what degree she does diversity work. I know we haven't really talked fully about it. And she might be on this Zoom call too. But yeah, we've had a lot of conversations with her. The person behind her on the PowerPoint is Shelly Strickland. Nicole, my wife, and she were roommates at NC State University. And before she entered into medical school, we had a lot of conversations about why Native people should be in medicine. And I remember, so back 05, 06, I began really rigorous, sometimes casual, sometimes very purposeful conversations with Lumbee people about why we in large numbers enter into medicine, whether we're physicians, nurses, PAs, and social workers, different types of healthcare providers. The photo here on the left is actually, I tried to capture some image from old Wake Forest before Holly got there, and she's doing some wonderful things there. Before she got there decades ago, Wake Forest University used to perform eugenics experiments on our people from our tribal community. So you have Lumbee people from southeastern North Carolina and some who lived in Greensboro / Winston-Salem who have testimonies of our people going through Wake Forest, just experiencing different procedures that were not normal. It could have been procedures on their eyes, procedures just on various parts of their body. This aligns with experiences that people in Minnesota had, where right before and during the Vietnam War, the U.S. government went into Ojibwe and other American Indian communities around Minnesota and performed eugenics experiments on them, the most famous of which were kidney experiments. So yes, my relationship with medical education continued later on. I finished my degree in anthropology at UNC Chapel Hill in 2012. In 2013, I became a visiting faculty member in medical humanities at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science / Chicago Medical School. Chicago Medical School actually began as a school that educated Jewish people who were not allowed, because of quotas, to enter into medical schools around the country. So they all, a bunch of Jewish medical students were drawn to Chicago Medical School to become physicians. I entered into the school as the only American Indian Native American faculty member. I led first year students through conversations as an anthropologist about, just everything, race, politics, economics, and really allowed them, I gave them an opportunity, a kind of an educational pedagogical platform to really push into the things that their other faculty members in, physiology and different clinical prep courses could not really teach them. And if you see the photo right here in the top right, students in SNMA, which is essentially the students in SNMA are mostly African American or Black American students. There's sometimes a Latino, sometimes American Indian students, but the students from this group back in I think 16 sent me a message saying that they had delivered my award, and I was like, "What is this award?" They called it the Lowry's, not Lowry's, but Lowry's Seasoning Award, because they said I properly seasoned conversations in and around medical education. And I thought that was really neat, because I feel like at that time I was sort of theoretically and professionally making an argument that medicine needed more anthropologists teaching medical relationships, medical knowledge, if you will. And that kind of proved it in that moment, with their limited funds, because a lot of medical students starve. So I think this paper plate was actually a symbol, not just of my dedication as their mentor, but also of the poverty they were dealing with as medical students, and which is a conversation that we don't have time for here, but that we need to have in the medical community. As I wrote a blog post around that time called Healing the Healer, and I asked the question, what does it mean when the people you're asking to heal America from the history of genocide, from the healthcare ramifications of genocide? What does it mean when you're actually starving them as they're training to become these healers? Anyway, I'll move on. I want to go back to this football player that I showed you in the opening screen. His name was Laurent Tardif. And I found it interesting that a lot of news media folks paid a lot of attention to him. For one, they didn't kind of ask questions about why he always wore Chiefs insignia on his clothes, but they also didn't pay attention to the fact that he was going back to the Quebec area of Canada. Now, why is that important? Quebec has had a lot of issues politically, medically, sociologically around Indigenous peoples in healthcare. As you can see here, there's been copious articles about Indigenous women who have been mistreated. They've seen their families mistreated. They've been mistreated. There's stories of Indigenous women in Canada who quite literally, can't go into a hospital in Canada and feel that they will give birth and that their baby will, by definition, be treated with a sense of, respect, that they, as the mothers giving birth, will be treated with respect. So this is one of the biggest human rights crises in and around North American medicine that I think really hasn't been addressed to date. Canada, to my knowledge, has not given any official statement about it. And Canada, if you haven't been in the know, the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, visited there months ago and sort of apologized for his role and the Catholic Church's role in the boarding school era of Canada. And quite honestly, the boarding school economy that has defined Canada and the United States is directly is kind of hinged, is attached at the hip to the healthcare, medical, educational healthcare system in Canada and the United States. As much as the government and churches and different organizations were attempting to erase Indigenous Native people from their culture, from language, from being who they were, the healthcare industry at the same time, oftentimes in the same spaces, were attempting to damage, to ethnically cleanse, to perform eugenics experiments on these same people. Indigenous women in the United States and Canada have had their wombs basically ripped out of their bodies. They've been made so that they can't, even if they've maintained their body parts, they've been made so that they aren't able to get pregnant, to conceive, if you will. So this is a really difficult conversation, I think, that we must have with our students in the United States and more generally in North America as we move forward. But again, this isn't just about Canada, so don't assume that it's just a Canadian thing. If you don't follow sports is always a place where you can see the medical community acting badly. The window or the capture screen in the top left-hand corner is advertisement from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, who control, right, the kind of policies and the data related to public health in the United States. They actually cool off or kind of relax from their work, controlling healthcare in America, by going to Braves games in Atlanta. And I'll do this just so you know what it looks like. And tomahawk chopping, which is a derogatory, anti-Indigenous behavior that is practiced in the stadium that the Braves, quote unquote, the Braves play in Atlanta. And in the lower right-hand corner, more recently, the 2022 Kansas City Chiefs Fan of the Year was a physician in Kansas. I think she's by ethnicity or ethnic background, she's Indian American. So the other type of Indian, not American Indian, but Indian American from India. And I found it interesting as I looked through photos of the Kansas City Chiefs sort of fan pages, there were a lot of Indian American physicians associated with the Kansas City Chiefs. And I said, isn't that the biggest colonial irony, right? The Indian American physicians in Kansas City are participating in kind of like justifying, if you will, mocking of American Indian people in that area and in that kind of political and social and health space. And my question often becomes, and I've had this conversation across the United States, what does it mean for a American Indian, Native American, or more generally an Indigenous person to go into a hospital and their healthcare provider is wearing scrubs that is donned in mascots or symbols that mock American Indian Native people? What does it mean if you know that your physician, who's supposed to be taking care of the critical issues in your life, treating you for cancer, treating you for some type of other life-altering reality in terms of your anatomy and physiology, what does it mean for that person to, in their downtime, mock the people, the communities, the tribal nations, the sovereign tribal nations that you come from? And that's a question that I'll just leave here for now. This conversation in many ways didn't start, over a decade ago, and in many ways started recently. During the pandemic, the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard, not the Chan School of Medicine at UMass, University of Massachusetts, but the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard actually hosted a panel about health disparities and race. This was probably mid 2020, maybe late 2020. And it was hosted by an ABC News journalist, Deborah Roberts. And immediately, as you can probably tell, I was looking for the Native people. Are there going to be representatives from at least some general, some Indigenous nation or community somewhere, from Hawaii, Alaska, somewhere in the United States, from one of the 600 tribal nations in the United States? No, there weren't. There wasn't. And during the conversation, I played back this panel a couple times, and I noticed that as one of the deans, who is featured here in the kind of lower right-hand corner, as she introduced the importance of this conversation, in the middle of 2020 or early 2020, I think it was late 2020, where it was official that per capita American Indian people were suffering from COVID more than any other racial and ethnic community. They collectively went out of their way to state that every other ethnic racial group, Asian, Black, Latino, white, were kind of stakeholders in the COVID conversation. There was no reference to the suffering that American Indian people were enduring during these early days of COVID. Now, this was at a time when, if I'm not mistaken, the Navajo Nation, they weren't given any supplies to properly treat patients, mask, any type of exterior kind of protective gear. But the one thing that was being delivered to the Navajo Nation during that time were dozens and perhaps hundreds of body bags. And the message from the Navajo Nation, again, down in New Mexico and Arizona, was that they were being prepared to die and not to live. They were being told, essentially, through this kind of symbolism of providing body bags and not PPE, if you will, I think is the proper term, that they weren't being asked to protect their community and to live. They were being asked to prepare for death. And so American Indian leaders, not just in healthcare, but more generally in that area, were saying, wait a minute, when do our lives matter? When will we actually become part of these critical conversations about restoring health and equity and justice in the United States? This is part of a larger movement within the United States to dismiss Native people. During the 2020 elections, this popped up on CNN. You had every category listed, but guess where Native people were? We assumed that we were something else. Maybe we weren't even something else, but basically and more generally, this kind of dismissal of Native people in healthcare and public health was kind of mirrored or kind of paralleled are being dismissed in media and journalism. Now let's bring it home. Y'all ready to bring it home? Let's bring it home. Let's bring it back to where we're at. Here in Massachusetts, recently, Massachusetts General Hospital issued their annual report on equity in healthcare quality 2021. And guess what happened? You can look at the graphs and you can, based on what I just said, tell me what happened. Native people, American Indian people, Indigenous people are not a category. Now, they purposely, and hopefully you can see my cursor, they purposely put a photo up in their report, which aesthetically gave you the ability to say, this is a diverse group in terms of gender and race, right? That really created and crafted and took care of this data and actually presented it in a diverse and inclusive way. Well, guess what? Didn't happen. Here in Massachusetts, here in Boston, in the Boston area, this dismissal of Native people that we had seen on the national level was playing out in the kind of expression and the kind of display of health data, of health information in Massachusetts and Boston. If we were being honest though, and CDC sometimes does get the data right, sometimes they don't. It's really, it depends on what kind of disease state we're talking about. But when everybody was being honest during the COVID pandemic, American Indian people were taking the brunt of the COVID experience. And that is a conversation, again, that Native people were kind of hanging on to. If you're not going to talk about us suffering from COVID, and this actually became a conversation in the Lumbee community, if you're not going to talk about us getting COVID, why should we even try to take your vaccine? Moderna and Pfizer and these other institutions were saying, please vaccinate yourself. And Native people, especially in our community, the Lumbee, they are very keen, they're very wise, they're very observant. They said, wait a minute, we're not even listed in this national news data about, people who suffer from COVID. Why should we take the vaccine? Why should we give ourselves over to public health to vaccinate us when they don't even see us before they even prepare the vaccination? Okay. All right. So the question becomes, and there's a looming kind of elephant in the room, why are American Indians and Native Americans missing from medical data? This is a long conversation, but I'm going to try to truncate it into like 5 minutes. It began with the Declaration of Independence, which was authored in 1776, in which American Indian, Native American people were called, quote, merciless Indian savages. So from the very beginning of the nation, the United States, this great melting pot, this great place of the American dream, right? From the very beginning, from its inception, it was declared a place where American Indian people should not exist as we do in our indigeneity. We were written about, we were described as something that was against, by definition, the United States. This kind of antithesis or this kind of juxtaposition between the nation and Native people continued on in the Constitution, where there was a 3/5 clause. So white people generally, but historians would probably argue white men, were considered full human beings. What they called enslaved men or slave people were considered 3/5 of a person. And it left us in a particular interesting dilemma. What are Native people? What are Indigenous people? Well, we were 0/5. We were nothing. We were never considered to be human within the founding documents of the United States. Okay. Now, so that's law. That's how we're dismissed and erased. Then there's media. Some of you may be fans of Reservation Dogs. Cool show, is neat, right? But I think a lot of people in the medical community see Native people operating in this kind of space in the IHS clinic. They see Native people, if we do exist in their minds, as being on a reservation in the Dakotas, in Arizona, somewhere out west, right? They don't see Boston as one of the most prolific, rich places of Native American presence. They don't see that more Native people live in urban areas, and forgive me for not knowing the data in terms of percentages, but there are significant numbers of Native people who live in urban areas. And I think, please forgive me if this quote is wrong, that more Native people live in urban areas now than live in non-urban areas. But even if it was 1/3 of Native people living in urban areas, even if it was 25% of all Native people in the United States, that is huge. That's a lot. And Boston is one of the primary hubs. But to back up to Res Dogs and to this kind of image of the IHS clinic, a lot of people in the United States, in medical education in particular, imagine Native people as being in IHS, in this reservation healthcare space. And really, they kind of assume that this IHS space kind of guarantees that healthcare will somehow get to Native people, to the point where they don't practice, they don't create, they don't craft medical education into standard, everyday, non-Indigenous, if you will, medical education. And on that note, we have pedagogy. Long story short, there's a lot to talk about here, but there's a anatomical collection called the Terry Collection. A lot of anthropologists know it. A lot of medical anatomy faculty may know it. But basically, Robert Terry was a medical faculty member, I think, at Washington Medical School in St. Louis in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And basically, he would take the bodies of people who were not claimed by their families and use them for different types of archaeological, anthropological, medical analysis. He would use these bodies to compare to ethnic others. So if Native archaeologists studying Native America would say, I need bodies to compare white Native bodies, people would take the Terry collection and compare those bones to Native bones found in some area of the United States. Well, there was a problem within this kind of context of the Terry collection. It was assumed that Terry knew what he had. It was assumed that the bodies that he had were not American, Indian, Native American. Whereas in reality, there were a lot of indentured Native servants, slaves, if you will, in St. Louis, in the Midwest, in urban areas during the time he was collecting these bodies. So if there were bodies that were not claimed by families, there was a good chance that, some of them were American, Indian, Native American folks whose bodies were captured in the Terry collection and whose bodies still exist in the Terry collection. I've talked to a couple of archaeologists about this, and I think it's funny because they oftentimes say, well, it was the medical community that made the Terry collection a thing. And then the medical folks will say, well, no, it was archaeologists. They wanted the Terry collection to remain, as a collection of bodies. And they wanted to make it so that it couldn't be interrogated and questioned. What this point is sort of like, no, these types of anatomical collections have to be critiqued. But anyway, long story short, the Terry collection gives us permission to think that in Western American healthcare, native bodies, native peoples don't exist. And it can be seen when you enter into an anatomy lab, in any medical school across the United States. Most anatomy laboratory prep, if you will, does not go into the idea that these bodies that are presenting themselves in the anatomy lab might be American Indian, Native American people. And by and large, based on conversations I've had over the years, anatomy instructors do not have processes through which they prepare themselves in their laboratories for having American Indian, Native American, Indigenous relatives on the cadaver table. This gets into a larger conversation about the history of medicine as a place of violence. If you look at the picture on the left, these are butchers. These are people who cut up hogs and chickens and cows in the late 1800s. Well, who are these people on the right? They're not butchers, but they look just like the butchers. They're medical students and medical faculty. And I use those two images side by side because the kind of butchery of American colonialism, where literally America was all about stealing land, killing buffalo, killing all animals, feeding them into families of settler colonial folks who were just occupying the land from Europe and from mostly Europe. In that moment, so as the United States is progressing, right, there's these narratives of manifest destiny where there's this angel flying above, moving these people on the Oregon Trail. A lot of you probably grew up playing the Oregon Trail, moving them across the West. There was a mix of people who were dying, and medicine was trying to achieve a sense of healing and health and restoration of people that were moving across the United States. But then you also had people who were in charge of feeding the people, the settler colonial folks moving across the country. And literally those two groups, the people who were healing and the people that were feeding, were dressed alike, and they were doing the same type of work. Well, as you can see with this image in the middle, was this economy of Redskins, which is why we had to absolutely change the name of the team in Washington from the R word, the Redskins, to another name, because Redskins, by definition, in the United States, was a term used by people in government and banking and higher education to describe the profitability of capturing the bodies dead of Native people and bringing them in to be used in anatomical exhibits and medical education and museums around the United States. So this doesn't perfectly connect those stories, but I wanted to put those two images side by side because medicine isn't innocent. It isn't pure. It is by definition a kind of set of practices and an economy, if you will, of blood, of gore, of using genocide, using the breaking apart of human bodies, using the capturing of Indigenous bodies across the United States to reinvigorate and bring knowledge into what is now Western American medicine that we tend to praise and glorify. This violence extends into, so this image shows you men on kind of on purpose. This image, but this conversation extends into healthcare spaces that were mostly women. This is Dix Hospital in North Carolina. It was opened up after Dorothea Dix treated mental health patients in Massachusetts and Illinois. She moved that business down to North Carolina. And one of the jobs of Dix Hospital was to take in girls who were pregnant. And it became a kind of an exchange space for girls to give birth. And a lot of these children oftentimes were put into adoption and kind of given off. So you've heard the stories of boarding schools. Well, along with that was this economy of adoption of Indigenous children that was facilitated by healthcare around the United States. This gets into a conversation very quickly about the white coat and the kind of politics of the white coat. This very quickly is a conversation at the University of Illinois, Peoria. It's one of the newer medical schools. And this older faculty member, Patrick Elwood, states, one of the advantages of the coat and the patch is that people are reminded that we are the University of Illinois. Well, if I can be frank, that's not what it reminds me of. It reminds me that there's a medical school and a university in a state named after Indigenous folks. Illini is a name taken from Indigenous folks, and it's used to celebrate genocide. So the University of Illinois, their mascot used to be, or it still is, the Fighting Illini. And that mascot and that kind of imagery of Illinois as a place where Native people were put out of place and out of mind, and we now can create healthcare, is really odd to me, and I don't really understand it. So for medical students at University of Illinois to wear a patch that they kind of use and sell, or that they utilize to kind of connect them in some sense of healing, that does not address directly that history of the University of Illinois and the history of Illinois and America more generally, the genocide in Illinois and America more generally, is problematic. And if you go up to Chicago, the hockey team there, against the desire of local Native leaders, the hockey team in the NHL is named the Blackhawks. And as you can see in this news article down here to the right, physicians around Chicago, in this case from Northwestern, eagerly went to the celebration of the Blackhawks championship trophy, celebration, wearing their white coats. And I'm saying to myself again, this isn't just about Native mascots and the mockery of Native people being on a white coat. This is about this really casual connection between health and medicine and the mockery of Indigenous people that takes place in Illinois, but also takes place across the United States more generally. So this gets us very quickly to the Hippocratic Oath. There's been a move over the last probably decade of medical students who've wanted the Hippocratic Oath to be something that is for them and is sort of like written by them. This is an article, for example, where students, I think in Texas, were attempting to kind of re-narrate the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath, more generally, though, has several tenets. Do no harm. I will not use. There's a tenet of I will not use medical knowledge to violate human rights. I will do nothing that negatively affects the person's family and economic stability. There's this notion of prevention is preferable to cure. And the last that I have here is I will not be ashamed to say I know not. But there are several spaces of inadequacy within these tenets. And especially as the medical community says the tenets or says the Hippocratic Oath and then actually practices maybe something else. The first space of kind of inadequacy is the fact that American medicine individualizes the physician within the white coat. Everything is tied to the clinic, to the clinician-patient relationship. There really is no sense of community within medicine across the board. Medicine sort of as a medical school, as a kind of institution, sort of sits on stolen Indian land. It may do land acknowledgments like you did, which was, to a degree is good, but they aren't committed to giving resources and to really transforming themselves to be fully in community with everybody around them, especially Indigenous Native people. On that note, the American medical, and this gets to point two, the American medical school is often a hub for individuals who carry the weight of responsibility. And you all have probably gone through LCME accreditation. The LCME always comes to different medical schools and says, we want more diversity. Does the LCME put pressure on you to have Native faculty and to have Native students to make sure that Native students actually matriculate and graduate? To have Native Indigenous faculty who are able to educate students at every facet of medical education? No, they don't. I've been around when they've been reviewing Chicago Medical School. They absolutely don't care about the details. They want the appearance of diversity. They want the kind of echoing of diversity. They really don't want transformative diversity. They don't want justice, essentially, in medical education. And this gets to the third point. We are witnessing an entire medical community that knows not. So this gets back to the last tenet of the Hippocratic Oath. I will not be ashamed to say I know not. Well, we actually need a medical community who's willing to acknowledge that I know not and to give resources, because the medical community is full of wealth. We need a medical community that is willing to acknowledge that it doesn't know and that it needs to recruit people, consultants, faculty, etc., that know and that can actually invigorate the medical community and to place the medical community, most importantly, in relationship with the Nipmuc Nation and also with American Indian Indigenous peoples more generally across the United States and across, in the context of the United States, across the territories, including Hawaii and Alaska, that the American medical educational system has influence over. This gets into a conversation. I'm glad there's DEI people that actually plan this conversation with me. Diversity, equity, inclusion often structures diversity, equity, inclusion on stolen Indian land. And this is actually an article that came from David Acosta, the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, I think, for the AAMC. And it's funny how he articulates the rules or the kind of 5 principles of diversity and inclusion and equity, none of which talk about Indigenous people and all of which actually talk about building. And this is me just responding to this article, which I think is fabulous. I think it's really interesting and keen in how it kind of points out certain nuances of diversity in medical education. But I find it interesting that I'm assuming it's he, is articulating certain ideas about building and having intentionality and building critical conversations and developing and building new infrastructure, when there's really, at all medical schools across the United States, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 that are actually dedicated to Native communities, one of them being, I believe, in Minnesota, there's no scaffolding in your medical schools pretty much oftentimes for enhancing and building conversations and relationships that reverse states of colonial occupation. So literally your buildings are on stolen land. you don't pay rent, you don't pay fees, you don't pay, I call it a tithe, an indigenous tithe. You don't pay an indigenous tithe to indigenous peoples. You're not paying Nipmuc people money to be on their land. What you're doing oftentimes is sort of using the AAMC, these kind of general diversity statements about building equity and inclusion, and you're assuming that everybody's going to assume that you're doing that work and that it sort of includes Native people. No, you have to purposely say our names as indigenous nations. There's 600 plus of us in the United States, and you actually have to write our particular identities into DEI infrastructure, into DEI policies, into DEI plans going into the future. This gets into your charter as UMass Chan School of Medicine. You've had an oath to Indigenous people from the beginning that you've probably never even said to yourselves. I have an oath to Indigenous people. From the beginning in 1962, you had a charter to take care of the residents, the citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Guess who the first citizens are? Indigenous people. So if you've never had Native faculty, never had Native students, you've never really taken care of Native people and prioritized Native people in Massachusetts, you've been in sort of, you've not been obeying your charter. You've not been in kind of alignment with what the original writers of the charter intended, which was for you to prioritize and take care of the people of Massachusetts. Now, you may say, well, we've never had relationships with Native people. That's the problem. You have to have relationships, and you have to fund, not just in terms of money, you have to fund in terms also of human resources. You have to fund those relationships and actually develop them and make them credible, not just in your particular university space, but if I may say so, you need to actually be looking over at Mass General Hospital and other organizations that expressly eliminate Native people from, for example, health data, and say to them, as the official medical school of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we're not allowing you anymore to erase Native people from data. You know, that's just one example of a conversation you could have. But if you have those conversations, which you should, you kind of are required to do so, you would totally transform medical education, not just in Massachusetts, but across the United States. And with that being said, and let me actually shrink this down a little bit so I can read this. This is your Indigenous oath, and I want to give this to you as a model. This is my gift to you. As Native people, we love giving gifts, right? That's who we are. That's what we do. I mean, that this idea that I'm here kind of sharing something with you, you have to be left with something that you can take. This is what I would say should be kind of a scaffolding for your conversation going forward at UMass Chan. You are responsible to equip your students for the inevitability that they will go somewhere else to train and or practice. If their life in medicine is disconnected from relationships with American Indian, Native American peoples in the U.S., it is, by definition, a violation of human rights. If you are preparing them so that they are not in relationships with American Indian, Native American peoples, you are creating a medical brain trust, which through standardized exams and clinical training and professional relationships is taught to disappear, erase, and remain non-committed to Indigenous ways of being. You are preparing the student to stay shrouded in the white coat. And not just shrouded in the white coat, you're preparing the student to stay shrouded in a non-discussion of the history of violence that underpins all of medical education. You must move past the Hippocratic oath into a utilization of medicine to restore, heal, and live justly. And then the ultimate statement, that kind of final kind of icing on the cake, is first do no harm is impossible without first peoples in positions of medical authority. All right. So anyway, I will stop there. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Lowry.